Welcome to Power Play on this Wednesday evening. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa. Tonight, one-on-one with the U.S. Ambassador to Canada.
We can come together with a deal that gives Canada the lowest tariffs of any country that America negotiates an agreement with.
Pete Hoekstra joins us in studio and says a deal with Canada could happen before summer. That interview in moments. Then, strike delay denied.
Nothing has changed from day one other than that they actually gave an offer to us.
Pushing pause is in nobody's best interest. Let's hammer out a deal, get this done, and give everyone the certainty they're looking for.
Canada Post rejects the postal worker union's offer to extend Friday's strike deadline by 2 weeks. We're going to have the latest on that developing story coming up. Plus, Carney's cabinet strategy session. The Prime Minister is set to speak in just an hour after meeting with his cabinet for the last 2 days. What should we expect from his government with Parliament set to resume? We're going to tee that up with our front bench, then bring you the press conference live. All of that happening a bit later on in our show. First, though,
we can make our own cars. We have more energy than they do. We have more energy than anybody in the world. We don't need their lumber, obviously.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign last several months, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever.
I say never. I've had many things that were not doable, and they ended up being doable, and only doable in a very friendly way.
I like him. He's a nice man. We get along very well. We had a great meeting today. Really good. I think the relationship's going to be very strong.
the first months of Donald Trump's second presidency, as you heard there, have delivered a roller coaster ride for Canada. The president appears to prefer working with Mark Carney compared to Justin Trudeau, but we've yet to get a breakthrough on the tariff trade war causing economic angst on this side of the border. To find out what's next, I spoke with President Trump's new ambassador here in Ottawa, Pete Hoekstra. Have a listen to our conversation. Hi, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to welcome you here to Canada and also here to our set. I appreciate you making the time.
It is good to be in Canada, and yeah, I think it may be okay to be here today, but we can reach that conclusion when we're done.
Correct. I do want to start off. Obviously, I have a host of questions around the economic relationship.
I know you have pages and pages.
I know.
And pages.
I spent a long time thinking about the questions I wanted to ask. I do want to start on the prospect of the Golden Dome, though, and more specifically Canada's participation. Have there been formal conversations about that possibility?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the president's moving forward on a number of big initiatives, whether it's trade, tariffs, the Middle East, Ukraine. But he talked about the Golden Dome during the campaign, and it's like, okay, it's time to put one more thing into process. And I think he and his team decided the last couple of days would be a good time to bring it up. Mentioned that Canada might be able to participate in it. Canada said they'd like to participate in it, but there's a lot of steps that need to be crossed before we actually reach that point.
On the face of it, do you think it would be a good thing for Canada to participate in?
Well, I mean, we've had NORAD since 1958. I think that's worked pretty well for the U.S. and it's worked well for Canada. It's, I think, one of the only, if not the only, bilateral military relationship in the world. So I think it would. But I mean, there's criteria, okay? And some of those criteria are being questioned right now. One of the criteria for NORAD is interchangeability and interoperability. So that would mean that we're flying the same kinds of planes, we're using the parts, and it's all interchangeable and it's one system. Canada is challenging that. They'd made a decision to buy F-35s. That's now up for review. If Canadians are flying one airplane, we're flying another airplane. It's no longer interchangeable, and so that might even threaten NORAD without talking about new alliances that promise even more security and safety to our people.
Is it your view that that NORAD is under threat?
Well, if Canada decides to, buy equipment and those types of things that no longer are interoperable with America, it means that that's one of the fundamental agreements of NORAD. And if Canada can do what it wants, and if it decides to move in a different direction, we would have to have some kind of a discussion on NORAD, yeah.
Are those discussions, are you part of any of those discussions at this point?
No, not at this point, because, I mean, Canada hasn't made a decision on the F-35. They're just saying we're going to go back and reevaluate it. And I think at that point in time, it'll be important for the U.S. to point out, wait a minute, this is a fundamental basis for NORAD. Okay? And those discussions are not going on. The Prime Minister has indicated that some of these things are under review. And as I've said multiple times, when people ask me about the Prime Minister and where he's going and what he's doing, it's kind of like, let's give him some time to actually announce that. Let's wait for the, for the speech from the throne, which happens in, 5-6 days?
Yeah.
Exciting time for Canada. The King is coming. The King of Canada is coming. And, we will hear the speech from the throne. We will hear more about the exact agenda. A couple weeks after that, Canada's hosting the G7. So a lot of things in play before we get to, any major news and reevaluations or whatever. I'm hoping that none of those questions ever come up. Okay.
In principle, can I ask you, as the
You can
administration's
ask me anything you want.
I just want to ask in principle, because, look, I think over the last number of months, Canadians have, been somewhat startled to hear of alliances we thought were very secure questioned. I know that you'll have your view, and President Trump has his view. When you bring up NORAD, and I take your concerns around interoperability, for example, and interchangeability, but let's put those aside for a second. In principle, do you believe in NORAD? Do you believe in that alliance with Canada?
Absolutely. Like I said, it's been around since 1958. It's been one of the most successful military alliances in the world for 42 plus 25, 67 years? We should be thrilled with that kind of success. So no, I think we're totally committed to NORAD, modernization of NORAD, and those types of things. I don't think this is a question of us. I hope it's not a question for Canada, but that's not a story coming out of here. U.S. questions NORAD. Absolutely not.
Because you kind of did, to be fair, right? If we go ahead with the deal we already said a while ago we were going to, which is now under review, you don't see NORAD as viable?
No, I'm saying that the fundamental premise of NORAD was interchangeability and interoperability. If Canada wants to renegotiate those types of things, then it's up to them to approach the United States and say, hey, we want to go back and take a look at some of those principles. But again, the Prime Minister has not laid out. Let's give the Prime Minister and this team some time to lay out their principles. I've talked to a couple of the ministers, and I think, at least the sense that I get, is let's keep. We got a good thing going. We need to build off of the success, whether it's militarily, the military success, whether it is the business success, or just the personal relationships. We need to build off of those, all right? And that will be good for America, that will be good for Canada, but most importantly, we think it will increase the prosperity, the security, and the safety of Americans and Canadians.
In that vein, I wanted to ask you about the economic relationship, and speaking of negotiations, and ask you whether the Trump administration wants, to be blunt, a new free trade deal with Canada.
We want a trade agreement with Canada, absolutely. Okay, I always had trouble. I still remember the first vote I had in Congress on a trade deal. It was NAFTA. So that's the early 90s. Okay, well before you were born.
Sadly not true, but I'll take the compliment.
Okay, but it's and they said a free trade agreement, and it's kind of like, oh great, this is fairly simple. Free trade agreement to me is, you pull it out, and on one side, these are the tariffs that, we have on Mexican products. It'd be a big zero. Here's a product the tariff they had of us, and it would be a big zero. Free trade, right? That's free trade, accessibility. And I told my staff, get me a copy and I'll read it. It won't take long. Free is zero. And I got a book that was, that thick, and you go through it, and what is it? It's all tables of tariffs. Okay, asparagus was a big product of in my old congressional district. So you look in page 632, tariffs on asparagus, and then you go somewhere else, tariffs on apples, tariffs on car parts, and that's not free trade. Okay, I think we want to get to as free, as fair, as equitable, as simple trade with a partner who we have 5,000 miles. 5,000 mile border. We want to get to as free, fair, and equitable as Canada allows us to go.
Do you think, I guess I respectfully challenge, like, why would we believe that to be true when the United States initially are the ones who put extra tariffs? I'm not disagreeing with your point that free trade feels a little hard to believe when there are so many tariffs that were already in place on both sides. But there are additional tariffs that were levied by this administration that are in no way buttressing the idea of free trade.
Government of Canada Trade Commissioner Service, understanding the CUSMA compliant. 99.9% of products, we call it USMCA, trade coming south from Canada to the US. 99.9%, according to a Canadian government agency, is tariff-free today.
But that's not everything. That is, for example, that first there were tariffs levied on everything. Then it just stayed on steel and aluminum. Then if it was CUSMA or USMCA compliant, there was a 90-day reprieve. It's not as simple as you portray it at this moment in time. There are still distinct tariffs that are in place that run counter to the idea of free trade.
This is the Canadians saying this. This is not the U.S. State Department. This is not the U.S. government. I have trouble believing that number sometimes, right? But this is the Canadian government saying that that's the amount of because there's been bounces back and forth, all right? But the bottom line, whether it's substantially tariff-free coming from Canada going into the United States. And because like you said, there is a 90-day reprieve. I think that ends in that ends in July, at which point in time we'll either have a new agreement, a framework to move forward, or we'll see what happens at that point in time. I'm thinking we're all hoping there will be an agreement and a framework to move forward.
Do you think that possibility exists that soon?
Yes, absolutely.
Why?
Why? We just got to we did a trade agreement with China. We have a framework. We have a framework trade agreement with China. We have a framework for a trade agreement with the UK. I was in the meeting, where the two-part meeting. We had the scrum with the president and Carney, which I think they handled the 51st state issue. Boom, gone. They did it with a smile on their face. Went and had lunch. And it's kind of like, okay, let's get to work. Okay, here are the kinds of issues that both of us have concerns about. But in this hour and a half that we're going to have lunch, we're going to lay the framework for our teams to come together and present an agreement to move forward. And I absolutely.
Why would Canadians trust that framework when there was an entire other agreement in place that your president then contravened on multiple instances?
Yeah, there is no doubt, okay, and I think you got to be very, very careful with the word trust, okay? I spent a lot of time on our national security issues, okay? At one time in 2014, NATO met, and every country in NATO unanimously committed and pledged to spend 2% of their GDP on national security. I don't have a question in terms of on a day in and day out basis, do I trust the Canadians? I believe we can trust the Canadians and we can work with the Canadians. Am I disappointed that they're well short of their commitment on NATO? The answer is yes, I am. They committed to that just like the U.S. and they haven't. But does that mean that I go home or I tell my colleagues in Washington, you can't trust the Canadians? No, that has not crossed my mind.
I think that's a fair point. I think I've interviewed
Of
countless
course, it's
defense.
a fair point.
No, I think I've interviewed countless defense ministers about our record on that and the fact that we have not met our commitments. Right. But this is your president signing an agreement and then contravening it himself, and in the meantime, in the interim, saying that he would use economic force to annex us. I think it would be almost naive of us to not at least raise the question of trust in moving forward in an economic partnership. Would it not?
That's a question that you can ask amongst Canadians, all right? But if you ask me, can Canada trust America? It's kind of like, yeah, I think so. I don't think so. I know so, all right? There's a deep history going back between our two countries, all right? We fought side by side on the beaches of Normandy. There are lots of Americans of Dutch descent who were liberated by Canadian troops, including my parents. No, I believe you can trust us. I trust Canada. Are there issues that need to be resolved in a constructive way that I think the President and the Prime Minister demonstrated a couple of weeks ago that they can move forward? Yeah, I think so. I'm confident they can.
Is the objective, just final question, is the objective from your vantage point that all tariffs on both sides are removed? Like, is that, I feel as though Canadians have not really got even a clear answer from the federal government. Like, what is the end goal of all of this? Is it to go back to what it was before tariffs?
Well, the President has made it clear that there will probably be a tariff on every country that we do business with. Okay? I mean, he's campaigned on that and has said that. I think what I would hope that Canadians would be striving for is to lay out all the things that Canada has, the capability, critical minerals, automotive, energy. You go right down the list, things that we can work together on, defense, fentanyl, stopping the number of deaths in both of our countries from fentanyl, that we can come together with a deal that gives Canada the lowest tariffs of any country that America negotiates an agreement with.
So not no tariffs, but the lowest?
The lowest.
Okay, Ambassador.
And if, that could be zero, but I mean, the President, I think, has indicated, there will be tariffs.
Okay, Ambassador, I'm going to leave it on that note. I appreciate all your time today. Thank you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
A pleasure to meet you. That is the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, the brand new one. Our front bench is set a little bit later on to unpack what you just heard in that interview. Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, Carl Belanger, and Hannah Thibodeau will all be here. First, though, I want to turn to some news just landing in our inbox. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand is set to formally summon Israel's ambassador to Canada, confirming Canadian diplomats were part of a foreign delegation in the West Bank when Israeli military forces fired shots in their vicinity. The minister also said on social media, quote, relieved to know our team is safe, spelling out, I have asked my officials to summon Israel's ambassador to convey Canada's serious concerns. We expect a full investigation and accountability. Now, CTV News did reach out to the Israeli embassy for reaction to that post on social media from the Foreign Affairs Minister. We have not yet received a response. When we do, I will be sure to share it with you. Coming up on Power Play after a short commercial break, we've got some developing news on the Canada Post story. The company has rejected the union's offer for a 2-week strike delay. Find out why next.
Nothing has changed from day one other than that they actually gave an offer to us. And the fact that they don't want to wait another 2 weeks for us to evaluate it, to see if it's ratified by the membership. It's not going to be done tomorrow.
After this lengthy delay, this service disruptions from the strike last year, and everyone looking for certainty, our volumes are way down. Our employees are scared. Our customers are frustrated. They're looking for us to get a deal and to treat this with the urgency that it deserves.
Welcome back to Power Play. As a strike at Canada Post looms this Friday, the company gave a new offer to the union today that proposes a 13.59% wage increase across a 4-year period. The union, meanwhile, said they would be open to a 2-week pause on any kind of strike action as they review the offer tabled by the company. The company, however, rejects that delay or that proposition, meaning postal workers could once again be off the job Friday for the second time in 6 months. With us now with some of the latest details is our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture. Hey, Mike, good to have you here. So why is the company rejecting the idea of a 2-week pause?
Yeah, they're basically saying that, look, we've been at this for 2 years already, and what is 2 more weeks going to accomplish? They've also had a pause that was about 4 months. You'll remember when the government said, okay, look, we need to study this right now. And so they said everybody has to go back to work. Everybody has to stop with this type of job action. And that is where we got that Kaplan report that came out last week. Now, Vashi, I think what's interesting in all of this is that offer for the 2 weeks that they said that they wanted to was so that they would delay their strike action. Now, they're not doing that, but the company is also saying they haven't given 72 hours of a lockout. So what the company is essentially saying to the union is, if you have any questions about this new global offer, we'll come to the table, we'll answer them there at the table, and saying that, look, a number of their volumes are way down. They do not have any amount of volumes to actually get a lot of their workers back to work. This is what the company is saying. And they said that, look, they need this certainty for their customers. Get people back to work, keep them at work, and make sure that they get some sort of agreement by this Friday.
So what about the union? Because I think the big question for them was how much movement this offer would represent from the last offer. That report, that Kaplan report, mentioned how many times they'd been at the table over the last 6 months, and it all had just continually kept falling apart. Is there any indication that that won't be the case this time with this offer?
Yeah, right now the union says they still have to take a look at this because it was this type of global offer. But when you consider where the movement was, now the last wage increase was about 12% over 4 years. This one is 13.59, as you had mentioned. Then you also have to consider some of the different movements in this new offer as well, which is they moved back to this old health benefits plan that the union had preferred. They also changed the post-retirement benefits, and instead of enrolling people in this new defined pension, they're keeping them in a defined benefit plan instead of a defined contribution plan. That is something that a number of unions have been fighting against. The real crux of it here, though, Vashi, is the weekend delivery, and that is something that both sides are digging their heels in on. The union says that that work has to be done by full-time employees. And the company wants that flexibility to have it done by part-time employees because they're saying that, look, we have to keep up with all of these delivery services that operate with part-time employees and making sure that we remain competitive here with them because parcels are where it's at. Mail and letter service is really way down. They're doing basically none of it anymore.
So prospect of a strike on Friday. Higher than it was maybe 24 hours ago.
Definitely higher than it was, but I think this gives a little moment of pause for the union to say, okay, look, can we get something done? Because they know there could be a public relations issue to this, and they're fully understanding that people are looking at this and sort of throwing their arms up and saying another postal strike, or especially when you consider that Canada Post says they have not given that 72 hours lockout notice. This is really putting the pressure on the union now.
Let's see if they don't for the rest of the week. Okay, Mike, thank you so much. Our senior political correspondent, Mike LeCouture, coming up tonight on Power Play. As you heard earlier on our program, the U.S. ambassador to Canada says a deal with this country, a trade deal with Canada, could happen before July. Today, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne is sitting down with his U.S. counterpart, Scott Bessent, at a G7 finance ministers meeting in Alberta. We're going to find out how that meeting went next.
You'll see? All right, let's go to work.
G7 finance ministers meeting today in Banff, where the theme of economic stability is front and center. The meeting comes against the backdrop of concerns, of course, surrounding global tariffs initiated by the U.S. Canada's finance minister is meeting with his American counterpart. Speaking of that today, our Rachel Aiello is reporting for us from Banff with the very latest. Hi, Rachel.
Hey, Vashi. Yeah, so today was the official start of the G7 finance ministers meeting here in Banff, and Canada's Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne sought to frame the summit as being about tackling the most pressing financial issues collaboratively. Among the agenda items, AI, global growth, and economic security. Now, the Canadian delegation's emphasis on trying to find common ground comes as, of course, U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs loom over the gathering of the world's largest economies. And while trade action isn't explicitly on the agenda, you can be sure it's being talked about. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is in town for the talks, and he's likely to be hearing from the other G7 members about the economic impact of the trade war. Among them, Canada. I've confirmed, Vashi, that sometime before dinner here tonight, Champagne and Bessent will have a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of this summit. His office is saying tight-lipped on the sit-down, but we may hear more about how it went during tomorrow's closing press conference. Vashi?
All right, thanks so much, Rachel. Rachel Aiello reporting for us from the G7 finance ministers meeting in Banff. Coming up, we're going to pick the conversation up from there, talk more about the U.S. ambassador's comments on this program, dropping some big news. He says a trade deal between the U.S. and Canada could be on the table as soon as this summer. It won't be no tariffs, but it could be the quote-unquote lowest tariffs. Our front bench is standing by to unpack what that could mean after a short break. There they are, Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, Carl Belanger, and Hannah Thibodeau. We're all back in just a few minutes.
The president has made it clear that there will probably be a tariff on every country that we do business with. Okay, I mean, he's campaigned on that and has said that. I think what I would hope that Canadians would be striving for is to lay out all the things that Canada has, the capability, critical minerals, automotive, energy. You go right down the list, things that we can work together on, defense, fentanyl, stopping the number of deaths in both of our countries from fentanyl, that we can come together with a deal that gives Canada the lowest tariffs of any country that America negotiates an agreement with.
So not no tariffs, but the lowest.
The lowest.
That is Donald Trump's new ambassador here in Ottawa, Pete Huckstra, on this program earlier, saying Canada could get a trade deal with the U.S. before the summer in a wide-ranging interview. But should Canadians trust him when he says that? Let's bring in the front bench. Sharon Carr is former Deputy Chief of Staff to former Liberal Finance Minister Bill Morneau. Jamie Ellerton is a Conservative strategist and the founder and principal of Conaptus. Former interim NDP National Director Carl Belanger is with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And Hannah Thibodeau rounds us out tonight. She's a former news anchor, now an executive communications officer at Global Public Affairs. Hi, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Hello. Good to see you. Jamie, I'm going to start with you. And I wonder what you take from, I guess for me, the biggest news out of the trade conversation, the trade portion of the conversation was not only that some sort of deal could be arrived at, but conclusively, it won't be a no tariff deal. That maybe we can get the quote unquote lowest tariffs, but it won't be a no tariff deal, which kind of reframes, which we knew, but not in so many specific terms, reframes the potential economic relationship between our two countries, I would think.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that stood out for me is just how much of a professional Ambassador Hoekstra is. He's clearly did his homework. He's confident. He's very personable and charming. I have no doubt he'll be popular in Ottawa and not have issues making friends. And I think perhaps the best thing we could hope to get out of a U.S. ambassador is a direct line into the White House to actually translate on a day-by-day basis what is going on in the president's head and how directives that come out of it are translating through not only the State Department, the Pentagon, but across the U.S. government, and to how Canada can kind of frame whatever it is we need to do to create the best deal that is possible. I still think when you listen to what the ambassador has to say, he very much sounds like an older style Republican, which is a kind of Bayesian rationality and some principles and kind of someone you could do a deal with the way that we would expect to work between Canada and the United States. But the reality is we don't get that with President Trump. And I still think it's very much a wild card as to what this is going to be. And no matter what the ambassador says, we're one late night True Social post away from it all going out the window.
Yeah, I think that's why, Sharon, to Jamie's point, I kept pushing the question of trust, right? Which I know not everyone loves, but I do feel in this instance like we have on the other side someone who made a deal, contravened the deal over and over and over again, and by the way, in the middle of it all, threatened to use economic force to annex us on a number of occasions. Like, if we do arrive at something in July, like, is it worth the paper it's written on? And how do you communicate that to Canadians?
Well, I think we always have to operate as if it's not, because again, we live in a time where if you say the wrong thing, you make the wrong gesture, you do anything, you're going to see like a threat of 200% tariffs the next day. So I think we always have to be cautiously optimistic. But watching that interview and kind of listening to what he had to say, I would say I was at least hopeful that the temperature was down when he kept saying the lowest amount of tariffs. It's a big change from us hearing what we were hearing over the last like several months. And I think a lot of this has to do with the shift in government. We saw Carney down in Washington, and we saw that really interesting video that came out after that was kind of lovey-dovey and all nice. So I think what the ambassador said was hopeful. Whether or not it leads to us having full trust in the U.S., I don't think we'll ever have that as long as we have somebody who is willing to flip a table at any single gesture.
Interestingly, it also sounds, Carl, like, and the Prime Minister has framed it this way, economic and security. But on security, he was pretty specific, like, if you don't go with the F-35s, like, good luck, and I'm paraphrasing, but good luck on NORAD. If they're willing, like, it sounds like it's all part and parcel of one conversation that has to take place.
Yeah, I suppose that's correct. And the problem, though, that I had with the ambassador's interview is that he was using a lot of conditional words, a lot of probably, could, and could be the lowest, could be zero, never say never, like, where are we going with this, right? So the question of trust, I don't share the optimism of Jamie that this guy, will be the direct line to the president. I don't believe that for a second. He sounded like a guy who was hedging his bet and trying to decipher himself what the president was doing and wanted to do. It's not clear because, as Jamie said, and on that I agree, we are one Truth Social post away from changing everything. And this is where the relationship with the United States will not be the same for a long time, even after President Trump leaves office, because who knows who the next president, will be and what he will do and how he will behave. So, come back to the original question about the, wordlessness of the paper these deals are signed on. I mean, the truth is, we have a good trade deal right now, and it's out the window. And then we're gonna have maybe one in July that would last for, how long? It depends on the whim of the next president, I suppose.
And I just think that lays the ground. Like, no matter who were to be in government right now, Hannah, it has to be an immense challenge because you're going to pour all these resources into trying to land on something that you can then, at least try and make it so that we're not in a crisis. But honestly, like, I don't know how anybody, regardless of party, ends up doing that when it is so destabilizing on the other side.
Get destabilizing, but also I agree with Carl when it comes to the ambassador and sort of disagree with Jamie that he's going to make a lot of friends in Ottawa. He's come in hot ever since he has taken over the role in Ottawa. On your show, one of the great things is that he's saying, the fact that Donald Trump is saying Canada will become the 51st state, forget that. That's done, that's over. That's a good thing. I like that. But he came in hot on a few other issues, and I'll mention on your program, the fact saying if we reevaluate this $19 billion contract on F-35s with Lockheed Martin, a U.S. company, then we may be at a NORAD. I feel that's a threat coming to Canada and not being able to make our own decisions. Also, when he came back on the 2% GDP, if you don't reach that, then guess what? You may be out of luck too. But there's also the Golden Dome issue, which you asked about on the top. And we have heard that there are discussions with Canada on this. And this could be where he's going when he's talking about things like the F-35s, like the 2% GDP. But he also said to Politico, I believe it was, coming in hot and saying, I don't understand why you're so frustrated and how dare you take our products off the shelves. I think Canadians don't have that trust. And that was a really good question. When you were asking him that, I'm like, yes, thank goodness you're asking that, because Canadians don't have that trust with the Americans right now. And I think he needs to come back in and rebuild that trust and stop coming in so hot with Canadians on these issues and making these type of veiled threats about the F-35 purchase. Let us make our own decisions. And then when it comes to negotiating in the future, if there are things like the Golden Dome that he wants us to become a part of, I mean, that's a $175 billion project. And they say Canada has to pay its fair share. Where we're going to get the cash for that, I'm not 100% sure. But I did like when, and I'm going to end on a positive, I did like when he said things like, okay, we have to wait and see what happens in the throne speech, and that'll be our guide. So they are watching for those things from this government. But I think he needs to take a step back and realize that Canadians are extremely frustrated with how we've been treated by this administration.
My sense, Jamie, is that he doesn't feel he needs to. That I think the Americans feel like they have the big stick here because of the size of their market. I know obviously we have a ton to bring to the table as well, but my sense is that he doesn't necessarily feel like he has to tone down the rhetoric of the president. He did to some degree, but overall, because of that relative difference. I also think regardless of the issue of trust, which as I pointed out, I believe is very important, like we still have to go for it. I don't know what else we do. We're so, it is such an important market to us. It's going to take a long time to diversify, to build up our economy here. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. Like we've got to try something, I would imagine.
Yeah, this kind of also shows, I think, where Prime Minister Carney's government's in a really precarious position, because early on in the campaign, he said the relationship as we know it is over. And what is that new normal as we start to create that going forward? But on the other hand, everyone's clamoring for a deal. And it's no secret that there's a lot of economic interest at stake. The Trump administration seems to want to tie a lot more to a renegotiated USMCA NAFTA agreement that talks about other defense issues and the like. And I honestly don't think anyone in Ottawa really has a real strong sense as to what it is we're actually negotiating with and where the lines are getting drawn. Again, coming back to how unpredictable Donald Trump is. So I think with the U.S. ambassador, I think I frankly found his interview with you to be charming. When you kind of got into places where he was disagreeing rather than being disagreeable, he kind of just found a way to kind of tone it down a touch, even if on some of the substance he was very much delivering the Trump administration's line, which sounds alarming. And I think as having an ambassador like that in Ottawa, who is able to have conversations, difficult conversations, and maybe say things that Canadians aren't going to like, is going to be a breath of fresh air compared to the last Trump ambassador that came up here, which kind of left with a very kind of a prickly relationship with everyone she came in contact with.
I've just got about 30 seconds left. Last word to you on that, Sharon. I should mention the minister who oversees the Canada-U.S. relationship, Dominic LeBlanc, is in Washington today, I believe, meeting with Howard Lutnick, which is something the ambassador told us. And then we later were able to confirm through the government. We didn't even know that that was the case.
Yeah, I'll definitely say that we have to remember that dealing with the Trump administration is kind of like a choose your own adventure. If one day you want it to be aggressive, where it's like full elbows up, we're going to be a bull in the china shop, sure, there will be consequences to that. Or do we want to take the temperature down and let them say what they want to say and say that we're going to do these things, knowing that the end result will be different? And that was partially my experience dealing with the first Trump administration. And I think it's gone DEFCON 1 with this administration. I'm actually hopeful. I was actually hopeful listening to that interview because we all know that Trump only puts people that he trusts into positions, or people that are close to him into different positions. So I would think that he has some sort of line of sight directly into Trump and his inner circle. But I got to say, we've got to approach diplomacy differently. This is not the same type of diplomacy you would have in any other time. And I'm a bit hopeful from watching that.
He did tell me at some point, I'm not sure if it was during or after, that he does brief the president directly. So I don't know on how many instances, but he did say that was the case. I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We've got a lot to talk about, including the Prime Minister, who is set to hold a press conference in about 15 minutes' time. We'll look ahead to the start of the parliamentary session this week and what we might hear from the Prime Minister with our front bench next. Welcome back to Power Play. We're just a number of minutes away from the Prime Minister's press conference. We're going to carry it live here as soon as it happens. Prime Minister Carney, there it is right there. It'll take place at that podium. The Prime Minister has spent 2 days holed up with his cabinet in Meech Lake, plotting out their agenda with Parliament set to come back on Monday. What should we expect both from that Parliament and this press conference? The front bench is back to talk about that. Sharon Carr, Jamie Ellerton, Carl Bélanger, and Hannah Thibodeau. Carl, I'll start with you. I think the expectation setting for this government is going to be one of the most interesting things to follow. The Prime Minister during the campaign promised to transform this economy into the strongest one in the G7, to stop relying on the United States, as we were talking about in the last segment, a whole bunch of things. How much pressure do you think that's going to put on them as Parliament gets underway?
Well, there will be a lot of pressure because there's a lot of uncertainty right now. Even though the Bloc said, we're good to keep them up for a year, and the NDP, of course, is in no position to bring them down, and the Conservative says, well, we'll play nice, we won't be reflexively opposed to them. The truth is that there is no agreement in place. So everything will be case by case. Where do you get your support? And I will start with the throne speech that the king will deliver. The game of chicken will begin. And this is where the drama can unfold quickly. So the expectation, of course, is that, they have a mandate and they're going to have to face and they have cooperation from the other parties. But what does that look like? The fact that there's no budget coming up is an indication that this government doesn't really want to give a platform to the opposition to bargain with. So they're going to limit that to the smallest amount possible in order to survive the confidence vote that they will face and not give up anything in return so that they can control the political agenda and drive it forward.
And you've sort of seen, that's a great point, because I think, Hannah, you've sort of seen indications of that from the Prime Minister, right, who has been asked in previous press conferences point blank, are you going to enter into a formal agreement with the NDP? One word answer, no. Are you talking about anyone crossing the floor? Again, one word answer, no. Have you talked to Pierre Poilievre about what the Conservatives might support? Well, they had one conversation, but it was about a potential by-election. There was no conversation about, there seems to be a strategy like Carl has described, which is we can do this on a case-by-case basis, which very much might be the case, but it's also going to make for some interesting political dynamics.
Gosh, I hope it isn't a game of chicken starting next week. I hope we see a conciliatory attitude for the next little bit. There are too many issues out there to be playing parliamentary games at this point in time. We know that the throne speech is coming. We know that Mark Carney is going to run this government like a majority government, at least for the first little bit, probably a couple of years. I don't feel, even though, there is no official agreement, I do feel that the opposition parties do want to work to get things done. We do have what's happening south of the border to deal with. These are serious issues for Canadians, for pocketbooks, and for our future. And if we start to see parliamentary shenanigans like we saw in the last parliament, I think Canadians will get pretty disgusted pretty quickly because of the issues like the pocketbook, like the fact that they want to see the prices of things start to come down. The tariffs are going to start to increase costs. So they want to see that Mark Carney has control over this. I hope that the opposition parties give him time to do that. And we did hear from Pierre Poilievre when it comes to important issues of the United States and what's happening down there. He says that he would work with the government. So maybe Mr. Carney hasn't made that outreach to discuss certain issues, but I think in the throne speech next week too, it's going to be what we saw in the election campaign. It is a vague document. And as Carl said, the thing that is a bit peculiar, I would say, is that this man who was the governor of 2 banks is saying, okay, well, we don't need a budget coming up soon, because that's really going to drill down the specifics as to how much, what will be spent. And to push it off to the fall, I think is fair to say that that's something that really didn't play well in a lot of Canadians' books, as well as the opposition leaders.
Well, they didn't even push it off to the fall. They weren't going to have one, remember? And
That's
now
right.
and then over the weekend, it evolved from a substantial fall economic statement, and as you point out, to a full-on budget when the Prime Minister started answering questions. I think the dynamic of the promise of action, Jamie, during the campaign, I think that was one of the primary things that Canadians ended up being attracted to with the Liberals, and in particular with Prime Minister Carney, right? This promise to not just say I'm going to do stuff, but to do it and do it quickly is going to very quickly, we're going to see next week, come up against the reality of a minority government. Like, yes, a strong minority, but still a minority government. And I'm wondering what you'll be watching for in that regard.
I think that's spot on, Vashi. I think part of what I will be looking to see is just how much he's willing to play with the other opposition parties and kind of what political traps he's setting for them to fall into. I think there's a scenario where he actually looks to go back to the polls because of the opposition sooner rather than later. He'll say, you've hired me to do this. Here's what I'm doing. Parliament's not allowing it to go through. We heard you want change on issues, let's say, of housing. Not so hot with what Gregor Robertson was doing last week. Issues of crime, they haven't really done much of anything since the campaign, but I think they've still got time to show their work, to kind of look to where those really concentrated change voters were looking for change, to say, we heard you, here now, give me the mandate so I can actually get this through and go back to the polls. And so I don't think that's going to say spring, summer election, but I do think there's some traps there for the opposition. And I think if the Conservatives fall into the kind of knee-jerk reaction where they're just opposed to everything and kind of take that very obstructionist approach to parliamentary engagement that was such a hallmark of the last parliament and bring it to this one, I ultimately think that plays into Prime Minister Carney's hands.
If you're just joining us now, we are awaiting the Prime Minister. He is going to hold a press conference. We are told running anywhere between 5 and 10 minutes late, so that puts us somewhere between 5 minutes past the top of the hour and 10 minutes past. We'll be with you throughout then, up until then, and during the entire press conference. Sharon, what will you be watching for as far as the dynamics between opposition parties? Because I think both, actually all three of our panelists have really laid out that Canadians are entering this time with a different appetite for politics than they might have had previously.
Yeah, definitely. I think that we had that change election. It might not have been the change election that some were hoping for the results to be, but it was a change election in the sense that Canadians wanted the temperature to go down. And we saw that with them electing Prime Minister Carney because they felt that he would be the best person to take on President Trump. Now, I think what people are going to watch for is how civilized can everyone be? I know there's a lot of talk about why is the budget not happening sooner? And I just want to remind everyone, it's been less than a month since they got elected into power. The cabinet just got sworn in, and I feel like there's this level of anxiety of everyone saying, now we want the budget now. Of course, you know what? They can extend the House to sit in the summer, but my personal opinion is that the legislator, the House of Commons, is not necessarily where that's going to get done. It's often theatrics. Let's give them the summer to get the budget right. Let's give everyone time to get their mandates going. And I think that then come fall, once that budget is presented, I think people can have an opinion on if they feel that the tone and tenor has changed and whether or not the opposition is going to have a certain perspective. We also have to remember that Pierre Poilievre has to go into a by-election. So I don't think that the Conservative Party wants to ruffle any major feathers right now because they themselves don't have an actual sitting leader. The NDP is no longer a party. The Bloc is kind of just waiting and seeing what they can do. So we're in a precarious time right now. And I think that everyone is anxious for us to move forward, but we also have to remember that it's only been a hot second since they came into government.
Yeah, it certainly is a unique point in time. But to your point, Carl, and I should say that the Conservatives today released their list of shadow ministers and associate shadow ministers, so they've organized themselves ahead of next week.
Anyone missing on that list?
I was just going to say, there's one name that isn't on there, and it happens to be the leader of the party. So that in and of itself, like that has kind of dropped off the news cycle for the last 10 days or so. But that is going to be really interesting to see as well, right? Like the dynamics of that party, who have been very strong in opposition, without possibly the most strong of all of them in the House of Commons, their leader, Pierre Poilievre, and goodness knows when he's back. Maybe as early as the fall, but we don't have any specific dates at this point.
That's right. We don't know. And of course, the Conservative will if they're loyal to Pierre Poilievre, will want to play nice to make sure that he has time to kind of rebuild his political credentials in a way and come back in the House with a different persona. So that's kind of what we've heard so far from Pierre Poilievre a little bit. But, sometimes he goes right back to the Pierre Poilievre we know. After the swearing in of the ministers, he was going after them one by one. You think, oh, nice guy, but this, right? So that's the Pierre Poilievre we know. The fact that he's not in the House might change the tone, for sure. But I think Pierre Poilievre has also learned from what happened to Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole. And I think that's one of the reasons why everybody's a shadow minister right now. It's like, you don't want anybody to be upset at you. You want to give them everything so that they're pleased, so they don't go after you, and that nobody wants to be leader instead of you, because the next leader of the Conservative Party, and if Pierre Poilievre remains leader, there's still a good chance that he could be the next prime minister. You don't want to give that up. So you want to fight for that position, and you want to make sure that you keep it if you're Pierre Poilievre.
Any moment now, the Prime Minister is slated to come out, if we can show the podium there, up on Parliament Hill to address reporters. Hannah, what are you expecting him? What kind of points do you think he'll be hoping to make?
Yeah, I think today, we did hear from cabinet ministers going in, and they made a few flubs earlier this week. I think he's going back to, I'm the person who's going to address this cabinet meeting. We're going to hear about some of the priorities that he's putting in place. He's getting all of his cabinet ministers in line for next week. They're talking about what type of issues they would like to see in the throne speech. I know they're still writing this at this time, and there's different pitches to go in. He's going to come out and talk about the priorities that they are in on that meeting. It'll be interesting what the questions will come from the reporters as well, because he has his agenda to come out and basically talk about what he wants to talk about. But there's a lot of questions still out there when it comes to the issue of what type of conversations did you have with the U.S. administration when it comes to the Golden Dome that we've heard that there have been discussions about. That's something that's really interesting, because remember, it was 2 decades ago, I was actually around for it, when Paul Martin, decided that they would not be a part of the ballistic missile defense program. If Canada has decided that they are going to get involved in this, and I was looking at Dave Perry, who's a preeminent voice on defense in Canada, saying that Canada needs to get in this early. They need to start these discussions early. And that could be something that the Prime Minister may have had discussions with the President, that this whole 2% spending on GDP by 2032, I think it was his promise, 2030.
2030, yeah.
That 2030, that Arctic sovereignty, all of those types of things. This could be something that would really make the president happy if Canada was talking about getting involved in that. I'm really curious about it. Also, the issues of Arctic sovereignty, what he plans to do when it comes to discussions about resource development. There are so many things happening right now. It's just there's all the issues that he has to be dealing with and get those issues straight as we head into the throne speech next week, then the G7, then the NATO conference. It just is going to continue for him one after the other.
Yeah, as Hannah lays out, essentially Parliament is set to resume on Monday. On Tuesday, the King Charles, will be here to deliver the speech from the throne. And right now, the Prime Minister has taken to the podium. Let's take a listen in live. It's Prime Minister Mark Carney addressing reporters on Parliament Hill following a 2-day cabinet retreat at Meech Lake. A couple of notable things that we heard from the Prime Minister. First, he says that at the end, the conclusion of that 2-day cabinet retreat, he delivered, it sounded like one comprehensive mandate letter to his ministers. We'll have to figure out if that is the case in the fullness of time, just because usually each minister gets their own mandate letter. In any event, it sounds like there is at least one string that runs through all the ministries in which the Prime Minister says he tells cabinet ministers that they will transform Canada's economy into the strongest in the G7, that their mandate is to bring down the cost of living for Canadian families, to negotiate a new economic and security relationship with the United States, and build new partnerships with other allies to supplant what is, the ending of the relationship as we knew it with the United States from a trade and otherwise perspective. He reiterated the fact that there will be a full budget, he says. That is new. Over the weekend, the Prime Minister did say that in Rome. There will be a full budget in the fall. Last week, it was not going to be a full budget. Now it is a full budget. And he went on to stress that there will be cost savings in that budget, particularly when it comes to the spending on government operations. There will be new defense investments laid out, and that there will be clarity when it comes to the degree to which the economic uncertainty through this trade war with the United States, and really the global trade war, is impacting Canada's economy and the government's revenues. He talked a lot about kind of a new fiscal environment that the government will as I mentioned, not just be saving on costs, but spending less and investing more, something that we heard quite frequently through the campaign. He also got some questions about two issues related to foreign policy that I want to cover before I hand things over to my colleagues in Toronto. The first around what is happening with Israel in Gaza and Hamas in particular, sort of an escalation on Israel's part in Gaza. On Monday, the Prime Minister, alongside the Prime Minister of the UK, as well as the President of France, all released a statement basically saying that they were willing to consider sanctions if that escalation continued. There was, a question to the Prime Minister about, well, what are those specific actions that you're willing to take? He seemed to indicate that it was laid out as clear as it was in that letter in order for the onus to kind of be, and I'm paraphrasing, but the onus to be on Israel. And he said there are specific actions that they are willing to take, but he didn't detail what exactly they were. He also touched on the summoning of the Israeli ambassador to global affairs, to the minister, to explain essentially how there was firing in the vicinity of some Canadian diplomats. They are, I believe, through the statement from the Foreign Affairs Minister, not injured, but they expect, as he outlined, a full explanation and investigation from the embassy and from Israel more largely. And then there was, of course, many questions about the relationship with the United States. And in particular, something that came out yesterday, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, had said that he is embarking on creating this so-called Golden Dome, basically a missile defense system, the price tag in and around $175 billion. He said at the time that Canada wanted to engage on that, would have to pay its fair share. Our colleague here at CTV, Abigail Beeman, asked him point blank if there are conversations that have taken place and how much Canada would essentially be willing to spend on such a project. He did not answer the second part of the question, said that he wouldn't disclose at this point exactly how much money we're talking about. But he did on multiple instances throughout the press conference talk about what he viewed as the value of embarking on discussions or in a relationship with the United States when it does come to missile defense, and the idea that there are threats, maybe not specific in nature at this moment, but potentially in the future that would be prudent to guard against with such a system. I will point out the details on all of that are very slim. We don't know what Canada would be willing to contribute. We also don't know the full price tag. The president of the U.S. says it's $175 billion, but there are outside independent estimates within Congress, for example, that peg the cost at about 4 times that. So we will await any further information on not only what that program looks like, but the nature of the discussions between Canada and the United States. I will leave Power Play on that point. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Vashi Kapellos. I'll turn things over to our colleagues in Toronto after a short commercial break. They'll have your top headlines just after.